Each year, special operations forces conducting counter-narcotics missions in the dense jungles of South America encounter clandestine laboratories that push the boundaries of what criminal organizations are willing to weaponize in their pursuit of profit and power. It happens with such disturbing frequency that the Drug Enforcement Administration maintains a classified biological threat assessment unit with an annual budget exceeding $200 million, tasked specifically with identifying and neutralizing what internal documents refer to as non-conventional narcotic warfare capabilities developed by major cartels. The Colombian drug wars of the early 1990s saw the Medellin and Cali cartels operating at the height of their power, controlling an estimated 80% of the global cocaine trade, and commanding private armies that rivaled government military forces in both size and sophistication, with over 30,000 cartel operatives operating across the country's most remote and lawless territories. For a brief period during the summer of 1993, a 12-man Delta Force reconnaissance team designated as Kodiak 6 would stumble upon something so profoundly horrifying and biologically impossible that it would force the United States military to implement containment protocols that remain active in the Colombian jungle to this very day. But what exactly was the fungal organism that transformed an entire cartel research facility into a nightmarish hive of living corpses that hunted with predatory intelligence? And why did the CIA authorize a complete sterilization strike that erased a 4 square mile section of rainforest from existence just 18 hours after the incident was reported? The Department of Putumayo in southern Colombia stretches across approximately 24,000 square kilometers of some of the most impenetrable and biodiverse rainforest on the planet, where annual rainfall exceeds 3,000 millimeters, and the triple canopy jungle creates a perpetual twilight even at midday. This remote region sits at the convergence of the Amazon basin and the Andean foothills, creating a unique ecosystem where literally thousands of undocumented plant and fungal species thrive in the humid darkness beneath trees that tower over 50 meters high. The terrain is so hostile to human presence that entire valleys remain unmapped by modern surveying equipment, with temperature fluctuations between scorching days and frigid nights creating microclimates that support life forms found nowhere else on Earth. Indigenous Kofan and Siona communities have inhabited these forests for millennia, developing an intricate knowledge of the jungle's botanical properties that includes hundreds of medicinal plants, hallucinogenic compounds, and toxic specimens capable of killing a grown man within minutes. It is perhaps unsurprising then that the major drug cartels saw this region as the perfect location for their most sensitive and experimental operations, hidden so deep within the green hell that even the Colombian military refused to conduct extended patrols without overwhelming air support and specialized jungle warfare training. Long before the cartels established their hidden laboratories in these mountains, the indigenous peoples of the Putumayo region spoke in hushed tones about what the Kofan called Aikot Sampima, or the breath that walks, in a phenomenon described in oral histories dating back at least 800 years. According to the shamanic traditions preserved by village elders, certain deep caves and limestone sinkholes scattered throughout the jungle were considered absolutely forbidden territory, places where the boundary between life and death became dangerously thin. Spanish missionary records from 1621 documented the testimony of a Jesuit priest named Father Rodrigo de Alarcón, who described encountering an entire indigenous settlement in the Putumayo highlands, where every inhabitant appeared to be moving and functioning normally, yet upon closer inspection showed no signs of breathing, no pulse, and skin that had taken on a grayish-green pallor, with strange, fibrous growths erupting from their joints and facial orifices. The priest's journal, now housed in the Vatican's secret archives, described how these villagers moved with unnatural coordination, as if guided by a single will, and how they pursued his expedition party for 3 days through the jungle with tireless determination before finally abandoning the chase at the banks of the Putumayo River. The missionary wrote that he could hear them in the darkness, not speaking, but producing a chorus of guttural sounds that seemed to echo and respond to each other across impossible distances, creating what he described as the voice of hell itself calling to its children. More recently, declassified CIA documents from Operation Snowcap in the late 1980s revealed a disturbing pattern of incidents involving American advisors and Colombian anti-narcotics police who had ventured too deep into cartel-controlled territory in the Putumayo region. A 1987 report filed by DEA Special Agent Marcus Holloway described the discovery of a cocaine processing facility that had been abandoned in apparent haste, with all equipment still running and approximately $2 million worth of refined product left behind, yet not a single cartel operative anywhere to be found. What made the report particularly unsettling was Holloway's description of strange organic matter covering the walls and ceiling of the facility's main production room, a fibrous growth that laboratory analysis identified as belonging to an unknown species of parasitic fungus with properties that defied conventional mycological classification. Similar encounters were reported by Colombian army units operating in the area, including a particularly disturbing incident in 1989, where a 12-man patrol reported being stalked for 6 hours by individuals they described as moving wrong, like puppets with broken strings, before the unit broke radio silence and called for immediate emergency extraction. The soldiers who made it out alive were subsequently diagnosed with severe psychological trauma and transferred to non-combat positions, but their debriefing reports all emphasized the same chilling detail. Their pursuers had shown no response to warning shots, no fear of engagement, and had demonstrated an ability to coordinate their movements with eerie precision, despite showing no visible means of communication. August 12, 1993, 14:30 hours, and Master Sergeant Vincent Reaper. Kellerman was beginning to understand why the intelligence briefing had classified this mission as high risk even by Delta Force standards. Kellerman, a 15-year special operations veteran with 2 tours in the Gulf War and more classified missions than he could legally discuss, crouched in the thick undergrowth roughly 8 clicks northeast of the last known coordinates for a suspected Cali cartel bioweapons facility. His 10-man team, call sign Kodiak 6, had been inserted via night halo jump 36 hours earlier with orders to locate, document, and if possible neutralize whatever experimental operation the cartel was running in this godforsaken corner of the jungle. Staff Sergeant Miguel Priest Alvaro, their Colombian liaison, and the only team member who spoke fluent Spanish, was on point, his weathered face set in concentration as he studied a set of muddy boot prints that disappeared into a wall of vegetation so thick it looked solid. Technical Sergeant Derek Wire Patterson was monitoring their communications equipment, though the triple canopy and some kind of localized atmospheric interference had reduced their satellite uplink to intermittent static bursts that made command contact nearly impossible. The air was absolutely suffocating, hovering somewhere around 38 degrees Celsius with humidity so thick that Kellerman felt like he was breathing through a wet towel. And there was something else in the atmosphere too, a peculiar sweet-rotten smell that reminded him disturbingly of the mass graves he'd encountered in Kuwait, mixed with something organic and fungal like mushrooms left too long in a dark basement. Sergeant First Class Anthony Diesel Briggs, their heavy weapons specialist, was the first to voice what they were all thinking when he muttered over the team frequency that this whole area felt wrong. Too quiet, like every animal and insect in a 5-mile radius had decided to be somewhere else. They found the facility 20 minutes later, and Kellerman's first thought was that they'd arrived at least 2 weeks too late for whatever operation they'd been sent to disrupt. The structure was a bizarre hybrid of corrugated metal buildings partially reclaimed by the jungle, connected by enclosed walkways that suggested whoever built this place was deathly afraid of exposure to the open air. Corporal Jason Nomad Chen, their demolitions expert, was scanning the perimeter with thermal imaging and getting readings that made absolutely no sense, heat signatures that flared and faded in patterns that suggested movement, but with temperature differentials that indicated the sources had been dead for days. The main entrance had been torn open from the inside, not breached by external force, with the heavy steel security door bent outward on its hinges with enough violence to leave handprint-shaped dents in metal that was at least 2 inches thick. Staff Sergeant William Doc Moreno, their combat medic, knelt beside the first body they encountered, and his face went pale beneath his camouflage paint as he examined what had once been a human being. The corpse was sprawled in the doorway in a pool of dried blood so extensive it had attracted absolutely no insects, which Doc noted was impossible in a jungle environment, and the cause of death was immediately apparent from the massive trauma to the chest cavity, where something had erupted outward from inside the ribcage with enough force to shatter bone and tear through flesh. What made it truly nightmarish was the fibrous growth that had replaced most of the victim's internal organs, a network of pale gray-green fungal tissue that had colonized the body cavity and was now fruiting, sending up mushroom-like structures that had pushed through the skin at the joint's neck and eye sockets. The smell intensified dramatically as they moved deeper into the facility. That same sweet rot mushroom combination now strong enough to make several team members gag, and their handheld Geiger counters and air quality monitors were all registering normal readings, despite every instinct screaming that the atmosphere itself was contaminated with something their equipment couldn't detect. They were in the main laboratory complex documenting rows of glass containment chambers filled with what appeared to be human test subjects in various states of fungal colonization, when specialist Marcus's Tango Rodriguez made a discovery that would haunt Kellerman for the rest of his life. Tango had been checking the facility's cold storage units and found them still running on backup generators, their contents preserved at exactly 4 degrees Celsius, and inside were dozens of sealed containers holding samples of a mushroom species that wasn't in any mycological database they could access. Doc was photographing a cartel research log written in a mixture of Spanish and technical terminology, when Tango's voice came over the radio tight with controlled fear, reporting movement in the facility's lower level, something large and fast that had passed between 2 doorways without triggering any of their motion sensors. Sergeant Jacob Hawk Brennan and Corporal Luis Smoke Herrera moved to investigate, their weapons trained on the darkened corridor, when they heard it for the first time. A sound that wasn't quite a moan and wasn't quite a growl, but something in between, resonating from multiple directions at once as if whatever was making it had learned to throw its voice. Then the emergency lighting in the corridor flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness for maybe 3 seconds, before their night vision equipment compensated, and in that brief window of blindness, something moved with impossible speed and slammed into Smoke with enough force to drive him into the concrete wall, hard enough to crack his ballistic helmet. What they saw in the green phosphorescent glow of their night vision was a human figure, or what had once been human. Its skin split in dozens of places where mushroom caps and fibrous stalks erupted from the flesh beneath, its eyes clouded white and weeping some kind of luminescent fluid, and it had Smoke by the throat with one hand, while the other clawed at his face with fingers that had become something between bone and hardened fungal matter. Hawk put 3 rounds from his suppressed M4 directly into the thing's center mass at a range of maybe 6 feet, and it didn't even flinch, didn't acknowledge the bullets tearing through its torso. It just opened its mouth impossibly wide and lunged at Smoke's exposed neck with teeth that had become sharp and irregular like broken glass, and the sound it made was answered immediately by at least a dozen similar voices echoing through the facility's dark corridors, a chorus of hunting calls that made Kellerman's blood turn to ice because they weren't random, they were coordinated, communicating, telling each other exactly where the prey had been found. Kellerman was shouting orders over the team frequency, even as Hawk and Priest physically dragged the screaming Smoke away from the infected thing that had latched onto him. His neck torn open in 3 places where the creature's teeth had found purchase before they'd managed to pry it off with combined force that should have broken a normal human's arms. Doc was already working on Smoke with his trauma kit, applying pressure bandages and combat gauze to wounds that were bleeding in a way that looked wrong, too dark and viscous, while Wire was frantically trying to raise command on every frequency available, but getting nothing except static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with those hunting calls, still echoing through the facility's corridors. Kellerman made the tactical decision that every fiber of his training was screaming at him to make, calling for immediate extraction and attempting to implement their emergency exfil protocol. But when Wire finally managed to punch through the interference for maybe 10 seconds of clear communication, the response from their TOC was a flat order to maintain position and gather intelligence on what they'd encountered before withdrawing. The command made 0 sense given their current tactical situation, with at least 1 man critically wounded, and an unknown number of hostile contacts demonstrating capabilities that defied everything in their threat assessment briefing. But Kellerman was a professional soldier who followed orders even when those orders felt like a death sentence. He split the team into 2 elements, putting Diesel Tango and Nomad on security to establish a defensive perimeter in the laboratory's main corridor, while he took Priest Hawk and Sergeant Ryan Ghost Sullivan deeper into the facility to locate whatever documentation or evidence could explain what the hell the cartel had been doing here. What they found in the facility's administrative section made Kellerman wish they'd never accepted this mission in the first place. The cartel's records were meticulously maintained by what appeared to be a legitimate research scientist named Dr. Ernesto Villamizar, who had formerly worked for Colombia's National Institute of Health before being recruited by the Cali cartel, with an offer he apparently couldn't refuse. Priest translated the research logs with increasing horror, his voice shaking as he read entries describing how cartel scouts had discovered a series of caves near the Kofan indigenous territory, where a unique species of parasitic fungus, which Dr. Villamizar had designated Ophiocordyceps anthropophaga, grew in massive colonies that released spores capable of colonizing mammalian nervous systems. The cartel's initial interest had been purely commercial, believing they could synthesize the fungus's psychoactive compounds into a new designer drug that would dominate the North American market. But the research had taken a dark turn when they discovered the organism's true nature. Test subjects exposed to the spores underwent a transformation that Dr. Villamizar described in clinical terms that barely masked his terror, their higher brain functions shutting down within 72 hours, while the fungal network colonized their motor cortex and essentially piloted their bodies like biological puppets. The translated logs revealed that the fungus demonstrated something Villamizar called networked intelligence, with infected hosts able to coordinate their actions with precision that suggested they were operating as nodes in a larger hive consciousness, rather than as individuals. Ghost found a sealed file cabinet containing photographs that would feature prominently in Kellerman's nightmares for years afterward, images documenting the progression of infection in human subjects, showing how the fungal growth erupted from the inside out, transforming muscle and organ tissue into fibrous colonies that somehow kept the host mobile and aggressive. The final log entry was dated August 8th, just 4 days earlier, and consisted of 3 words written in increasingly erratic handwriting: containment breach, run. They were securing the research materials when Wire's voice exploded over the team frequency, with a transmission that was maybe 50% coherent words and 50% pure panic, reporting multiple contacts converging on their defensive position from at least 3 different corridors. Kellerman's team was sprinting back toward the main laboratory when they heard the gunfire start. Not the controlled 3-round bursts of professional soldiers engaging targets, but the sustained automatic fire of men who were scared and burning through ammunition, trying to stop something that wouldn't go down. They rounded the corner to find Diesel standing his ground with his M249 saw pouring rounds into a mass of infected that were advancing through the corridor in a coordinated wave that showed absolutely no regard for the bullets tearing through their bodies, and Kellerman counted at least 8 of them before he stopped counting and started shooting. Nomad had rigged a claymore mine in the secondary corridor, and the explosion when he triggered it should have stopped anything human dead in its tracks. But through the smoke and debris, Kellerman could see shapes still moving, still advancing, bodies so torn apart by shrapnel that they should have been anatomically incapable of locomotion, yet somehow still dragging themselves forward with their arms, while the fungal networks visible through their shredded tissue seemed to pulse and writhe with independent life. Tango went down when one of the infected that they'd thought was neutralized suddenly lurched up from the floor and sank its teeth into his calf, hard enough that Kellerman heard bone crack even over the chaos of gunfire, and the scream that Tango made was cut short when 3 more of the creatures swarmed him with a coordination that was absolutely deliberate, targeting his throat and major arteries with a precision that no mindless zombie should possess. Doc managed to drag Smoke, who was now showing the first signs of infection with dark veins spreading from his neck wounds and a gray pallor to his skin, into what looked like a reinforced containment room, while Kellerman made the hardest call of his career, ordering the team to fall back and seal the laboratory section with Tango still inside, because staying meant everyone died, and at least this way some of them might survive to warn command what they were dealing with. The last thing Kellerman saw before Ghost slammed the emergency containment door shut was Tango rising to his feet with movements that were no longer his own, his head tilting at an angle that was just slightly wrong, while his eyes already clouding to that characteristic milky white tracked Kellerman's position, with an intelligence that was absolutely not human anymore. The containment room bought them maybe 15 minutes before Kellerman realized with cold certainty that they weren't dealing with mindless infected anymore. They were dealing with something that was learning, adapting, using the combined knowledge and muscle memory of every host it had claimed. Through the reinforced observation window, he could see what had been Tango moving through the laboratory, with purpose, not shambling or stumbling, but walking with the practiced efficiency of a Delta operator conducting a tactical sweep. And worse still, it was examining their defensive positions with what looked disturbingly like professional assessment. Wire's equipment was going completely haywire now. Every sensor and detector registering readings that fluctuated wildly, as if reality itself was becoming unstable in the facility. And the temperature in their sealed room had dropped at least 10 degrees in the last 5 minutes, despite the jungle heat outside. Their breath now visible in the air like they were suddenly trapped in a meat locker. Then the hunting call started again. But this time they weren't coming from the corridors. They were coming from inside the walls, a sound that resonated through the facility's ventilation system and seemed to bypass their ears entirely and vibrate directly in their skulls. Doc was losing smoke rapidly, the infection spreading with horrifying speed now that it had entered his bloodstream. Dark fungal filaments visible beneath his skin like a roadmap of corruption, spreading from the bite wounds toward his heart and brain. And Smoke was still conscious enough to beg them to kill him before he turned into one of those things. Through the observation windows that lined the containment room, they could see them gathering. Not just the 8 or 10 they'd encountered before, but dozens, maybe 50 or more infected hosts that must have been the entire staff of the facility. Plus, God knows how many test subjects, and they were arranging themselves in the laboratory with a coordination that was absolutely deliberate, forming a perimeter that sealed off every exit route while leaving one corridor conspicuously open, like they were herding prey into a killing ground. Diesel was the first to really break his hands, shaking so badly he could barely hold his weapon, as he watched what had been Tango now standing perfectly still just beyond the observation window. Its head tilted at that unnatural angle while the fungal growths erupting from its neck and shoulders seemed to pulse and breathe with their own rhythm. Nomad was muttering prayers in a language Kellerman didn't recognize, something his grandmother had taught him in Korean, while Ghost had gone absolutely silent in the way that combat veterans do when they've accepted that they're not making it home. The infected were doing something with the bodies of the facility's original victims, dragging them into formation and arranging them in patterns that looked almost ritualistic. And Kellerman realized with mounting horror that the fungus wasn't just coordinating between hosts. It was demonstrating planning, showing them what would happen, what they would become. Wire's radio equipment suddenly erupted with a burst of clear signal. But instead of their command frequency, it was broadcasting something else. A rhythmic pulsing sound interspersed with what sounded like distorted human voices, all speaking in unison. And when Wire tried to shut it down, the equipment wouldn't respond. It just kept broadcasting that signal like the fungus had learned to communicate through their own technology. Doc had his sidearm pressed against Smoke's temple because Smoke had stopped begging and started changing, his eyes clouding over, and his breathing pattern shifting to something that wasn't quite breathing anymore, more like the fungus testing out the respiratory system it was inheriting. And Doc was crying openly as he asked Kellerman for permission to do what needed to be done. Priest was backing away from the observation window with his rifle raised, reporting in a voice that had gone absolutely flat that the infected weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving in perfect synchronization, every single one of them turning their heads to face the containment room at exactly the same moment. Dozens of clouded eyes all locked on the same target, with an attention that felt less like being watched and more like being studied by something vast and alien that was evaluating them the way a scientist evaluates bacteria in a petri dish. Then they came, not in a mindless charge, but in a coordinated assault that demonstrated tactical knowledge that could only have come from Tango's training, hitting the containment room from 3 directions simultaneously, while using what looked disturbingly like fire and maneuver techniques to advance under covering positions. Nomad's carefully placed explosive charges should have channeled them into kill zones, but the infected adapted in real time, with some hosts deliberately triggering the charges to clear paths for the others in a display of sacrificial coordination that was absolutely inhuman. Kellerman emptied an entire magazine into the first wave and watched with despair as bodies he'd definitely put lethal shots into just stood back up and kept coming. the fungal networks inside them compensating for catastrophic damage that should have been instantly fatal. The containment room's reinforced door was holding, but they could hear the infected on the other side not pounding mindlessly, but working methodically at the hinges and lock mechanisms with the fingers of multiple hosts. And Kellerman could see through the observation slit that they were using improvised tools, metal bars and pieces of equipment, showing problem-solving capabilities that made his blood run cold. Smoke had fully turned now, and Doc had made the call, the single suppressed gunshot barely audible over the chaos. But the sight of their medic executing their teammate was the moment Kellerman knew they'd lost, that this mission had been over the moment they'd stepped into this facility. Ghost was calling out ammunition counts, and every number was getting lower. Diesel's saw had jammed from overheating, and Priest was reporting that the infected had somehow accessed the facility's environmental controls because the ventilation system was now pumping air that tasted sweet and wrong and made their lungs burn with every breath. The door was giving way. Kellerman could see the metal starting to deform as dozens of infected pushed against it with combined strength that was bending steel, and through the observation windows he could see what looked like hundreds of them now emerging from every corridor and doorway, like the facility itself was vomiting up its victims. All of them moving with that same synchronized purpose, all of them knowing exactly where the last uninfected humans were hiding. And he understood with absolute clarity that they were going to die here in this godforsaken laboratory, and then they were going to stand back up and become part of whatever this thing was. The containment door was 3 seconds from complete failure when Kellerman heard something that shouldn't have been possible given their complete communication blackout. The distinctive turbine whine of an AC-130 gunship circling somewhere in the airspace above the facility. Wire's dead radio equipment suddenly crackled to life with a transmission in English, a voice identifying itself as Spectre 2-1 ordering Kodiak 6 to mark their position with infrared strobes and take hard cover in the next 30 seconds because they were about to bring hell down on everything that wasn't transmitting friendly IFF. Kellerman didn't question how Command had known to send the cavalry, or why a gunship equipped for total facility destruction was already on station. He just started screaming orders for his remaining team to get into the containment room's reinforced interior section and activated every IR beacon they had. The first 105mm howitzer round hit the facility's northern section exactly 28 seconds later, and the impact was apocalyptic, the entire structure shaking like it had been struck by an earthquake as hundreds of tons of concrete and steel were pulverized into rubble. Through the observation windows in the split second before they shattered, Kellerman saw the infected react to the bombardment with a coordination that was terrifying in its implications, every single host simultaneously abandoning their assault on the containment room and turning toward the new threat. Moving as one organism toward the breach, points to swarm toward what their collective intelligence had identified as the greater danger. The gunship made 3 full passes, and Kellerman counted at least 40 separate impacts from 105mm or 40mm and 25mm cannon fire, turning the laboratory complex into a churning hell of explosions and collapsing infrastructure. And through it all, he could hear those hunting calls continuing, dozens of infected voices screaming in unison, even as the rounds tore them apart. When the bombardment finally ceased and Kellerman led his 3 surviving team members, himself, Ghost, Priest, and Diesel, out through the smoking ruins, they found bodies everywhere, hundreds of them, but even torn to pieces by explosive ordnance, many were still moving, still trying to coordinate severed limbs twitching in patterns that suggested they were attempting to rejoin the collective. The extraction Blackhawk was already on approach, its downdraft kicking up clouds of spores that glittered in the fading daylight like malevolent snow, and Kellerman felt his lungs burn as he breathed them in and wondered with numb resignation if they'd really escaped, or if they were just spreading the infection to a new location. They were wheels up for exactly 7 minutes when a colonel whose name Kellerman had never heard and whose uniform bore no unit insignia appeared from the Blackhawk's crew compartment and informed them in a tone that brooked absolutely no discussion that as of this moment Operation Kodiak 6 had never existed, and neither had the facility they'd just escaped. The colonel's first order was for Doc, who'd remained with the command element during the insertion, to conduct immediate blood work on all 4 survivors, and Kellerman watched with growing unease as their medic drew samples that were immediately placed in biohazard containers and locked in a case that looked more appropriate for transporting nuclear material than blood samples. Through the Black Hawk's window, he could see a second wave of aircraft approaching the facility's coordinates, and the colonel explained with clinical detachment that a joint Colombian-U.S. strike package was about to deliver 16,000 pounds of thermobaric and white phosphorus munitions, followed by a comprehensive napalm saturation that would sterilize every square inch of the facility and the surrounding jungle to a depth of 6 feet into the soil itself. Ghost asked the question they were all thinking. What about the infected that had escaped into the jungle during the assault? And the colonel's response was a flat statement that containment teams had established a 3-kilometer perimeter, and anything attempting to cross it would be neutralized with extreme prejudice. Though his expression suggested he knew as well as they did that something had probably gotten out. They were diverted mid-flight from their original extraction point to what Kellerman was informed was a Level 4 biosafety facility at an undisclosed location in Panama, where they spent the next 72 hours in medical isolation, while technicians in hazmat suits drew blood every 6 hours and conducted neurological assessments that seemed designed to determine if they were still fully human. On the 4th day, the colonel returned with discharge papers that weren't really discharge papers but non-disclosure agreements backed by threats of prosecution under the Espionage Act, and Kellerman watched through the facility's observation windows as demolition charges were placed throughout the laboratory, where they'd been held, the same laboratory where their blood samples and all physical evidence of what they'd encountered were stored. The final image that Kellerman carried with him as they were escorted to separate military transport flights was the view from the Black Hawk as they lifted off, looking back at the facility and seeing in the tree line beyond the fence a figure standing absolutely motionless in the shadows, watching them leave with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like patience, like something that had all the time in the world to wait for the moment when humans inevitably returned to disturb it again. The official after-action report filed with United States Southern Command listed Operation Kodiak 6 as a successful counter-narcotics interdiction mission that resulted in the destruction of a Cali cartel cocaine processing facility and the elimination of approximately 40 cartel operatives in a joint Colombian-U.S. military operation. There was no mention of fungal infections, no documentation of the 11 American service members who had actually participated in the mission, and certainly no reference to the thermobaric sterilization strike that had scorched 4 square miles of Colombian rainforest down to bedrock. Master Sergeant Vincent Kellerman was reassigned within 2 weeks to a training position at Fort Bragg, with explicit orders that his counterterrorism expertise was too valuable to risk on further field operations. Though the mandatory psychiatric evaluations and the monthly blood work that continued for the next 18 months suggested the real reason for his new desk assignment. Sergeant Ryan Sullivan, callsign Ghost, was medically retired 6 months after the incident, with a diagnosis of service-connected PTSD and a disability rating that came with a pension substantial enough to suggest the Army desperately wanted him to stay quiet and comfortable, and he died in an apparent hunting accident in Montana in 1997 under circumstances that the local sheriff described as unusually suspicious, before federal authorities took over the investigation and the case was quietly closed. Staff Sergeant Miguel Alvaro, known as Priest, returned to Colombia and continued his liaison work with U.S. forces until 2001, when he simply disappeared during a routine patrol in the Putumayo region. His body never recovered, despite extensive search operations that were called off after just 48 hours on orders from Bogota. Sergeant Anthony Briggs Diesel remained in active service, but was transferred to administrative duties in Germany, where he became increasingly paranoid about what he described in emails to Kellerman as watching the symptoms, convinced that the spores they'd inhaled during extraction were still dormant in their systems, waiting to activate, and in 2003 he was found dead in his off-base apartment from what the official investigation ruled as suicide by overdose, though no suicide note was ever found, and toxicology reports were sealed under national security provisions. The physical evidence from the facility, including Dr. Villamizar's research logs, the fungal samples, and the hundreds of photographs documenting the infected subjects were reportedly stored in a classified biological materials vault at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick. though when congressional investigators attempted to audit the facility's inventory in 2008, following a Freedom of Information Act request, they were informed that no such materials existed and never had. The families of the 6 Delta Force operators who died during the mission, Tango, Smoke, Wire, Doc, Nomad, and Hawk, were told that their loved ones had perished in a training accident involving a helicopter crash in North Carolina, and the closed casket funerals were attended by officers who knew the truth but would carry it to their graves rather than admit what the United States military had encountered in that Colombian jungle. What neither Kellerman nor any of the surviving team members knew was that the Putumayo incident was far from isolated, but rather part of a pattern that extended back through recorded history and across multiple continents, with a consistency that suggested something far more ancient and widespread than a localized Colombian phenomenon. A 1943 OSS intelligence report from the Pacific Theater described an entire Japanese garrison in Papua New Guinea that was found by Allied forces in a state matching exactly what Kodiak 6 had encountered, with evidence suggesting the soldiers had been infected by something in the jungle and subsequently firebombed by their own command to prevent spread. Soviet military documents released after the USSR's collapse revealed that Red Army units operating in the Siberian taiga during the 1960s reported multiple encounters with what they termed Gribnoy Soldat, or mushroom soldiers, infected individuals demonstrating the same hive intelligence and parasitic fungal colonization, and these incidents were handled with the same scorched earth response protocols that the US military would later adopt. Most disturbing was the discovery by CDC researchers in 2015, working under a black budget program investigating emerging biological threats, that the specific species of Ophiocordyceps encountered in Colombia had genetic markers indicating it was not native to South America at all, but rather showed DNA similarities to fungal species found in samples from caves in Iraq, Indonesia, and the Congo Basin, suggesting either impossible worldwide distribution or something far more unsettling about its origin and purpose. The recurring pattern across cultures and centuries points to an uncomfortable truth that military and scientific establishments refuse to publicly acknowledge: that humanity shares this planet with something else, something that has learned to use our own bodies as vehicles, that demonstrates intelligence and coordination, that may represent a form of consciousness so alien to our understanding that we lack even the conceptual framework to comprehend what it is or what it wants. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.